Let me outline a definitive metric regarding the absolute audacity of a woman who completely abandons her 3-year-old son, completely drops off the geographic grid for more than a decade, and then suddenly materializes 20 years later, flanked by a high-priced legal team, a pristine Manhattan blowout, and the unadulterated nerve to label herself a deeply concerned biological mother. I am adding an explicit asterisk to that statement because I did not observe this structural betrayal from a distance. I lived through every single line item of its wreckage. And if your diagnostic calculation suggests you already comprehend exactly where this narrative ledger is going to settle, I promise you with absolute certainty that you do not. My name is Garrick Vance. I am 53 years old. I take my coffee completely black, and for the last 2 continuous decades, I have operated as the solitary parental anchor my son, Davis, has ever known on this earth. I say my son, and I mean it in every single quantitative way that carries actual legal and emotional weight. Biology does not determine the sovereign status of parenthood. Consistently showing up every single morning for 20 continuous years is the only metric that carries absolute validity. Every medical therapy appointment I drove to entirely alone down the icy corridors of Route 1, every single tenth school IEP conference where I sat completely isolated on our side of the table, and every freezing night I spent sleeping flat on the hardwood floor outside his bedroom door, just so his nervous system could track my steady breathing and comprehend that someone was still maintaining the perimeter. That is what balanced the ledger. Showing up made me his father. Welcome to Dad's ultimate payback. Before we dissect the specific forensics of this corporate asset grab, do me a critical favor. Hit that like button with absolute certainty. Drop a detailed comment below letting me know exactly what city, state, or country you are monitoring this broadcast from, and ensure you are permanently subscribed to our database. Trust me, you are going to want to observe every single layer of this counterstrike. To fully comprehend the structural load of this conflict, you must understand the 10% dramatic variable that initiated our isolation. I met Eleanor when I was 29, miscalculating her sharp transactional charm for actual human depth. Our son Davis was born a year later, and at exactly age 2, he received a formal clinical diagnosis of high-functioning autism. Let me be unequivocally clear. Davis's developmental path is not a tragedy. That boy possesses one of the most extraordinary, structurally flawless minds I have ever encountered. But Eleanor looked at the clinical risk data and saw nothing but an immediate, permanent detour from the elite, image-conscious Upper East Side social standing she had carefully engineered. I watched the psychological eviction occur in real time. The cold withdrawal, the refusal to sit on his side of the play area, the systemic erasure of her presence. She never whispered a single word to me about an operational exit. One freezing Tuesday morning when Davis was 3, sitting quietly on the timber floor, lining up his maritime blocks in perfect geometric sequence, Eleanor kissed my cheek, stated flatly she was driving to the local market, and never returned. She liquidated her domestic assets and fled to Manhattan with Robert, a senior corporate equity partner from her firm, leaving behind a 3-year-old boy who spent the next 4 days walking to the front door, pulling it open, and staring blankly down the empty, snow-covered driveway. Some historical debts are carried in absolute silence. You simply absorb the weight and keep moving forward. I raised him entirely alone in our rugged stone and timber home carved into the freezing, wind-swept coast of Bar Harbor, Maine. I spent my daylight hours working back-breaking shifts as an artisanal boat builder, shaping premium cedar hulls against the Atlantic tides, and dedicated my nights to analyzing advanced special education resources by the light of the wood stove. I systematically memorized his sensory triggers, mapped his behavioral rhythms, and learned the exact metric by which his heavy canvas blanket required folding at the left corner or sleep simply ceased to occur for either of us. It was during these quiet years that I discovered Davis communicated with the external world not through erratic verbal scripts, but through hyper-focused, structurally perfect canvas paintings. His mind possessed a flawless photographic memory, translating the raw, jagged beauty of the Maine coastline into complex architectural layers of oil and acrylic. By age 7, our entire timber workshop looked like an elite fine art museum. Visitors would step across the threshold and stop mid-sentence, completely paralyzed by the sheer aesthetic authority of a child's work. At exactly age 14, the fine art market finally intersected with his genius. Davis's definitive maritime masterwork was selected by a premier curator and sold at a high-stakes commercial auction house in Manhattan for an astonishing $2.9 million. I remember sitting in the concrete parking garage after the final gavel fell, executing a full, unvarnished ugly cry, the precise kind of physiological release where your shoulders shake violently and your lungs completely fail to capture oxygen. I didn't place a single phone call to celebrate because within our isolated ecosystem, there was absolutely nobody else to call. It was simply me and my boy. Davis reached across the truck seat, patted my arm with absolute calm deliberation, and stated in his level, unhurried cadence, "Do not compromise your composure, Dad. I calculated the market trends in 2019 before I initiated the first brushstroke. I knew the canvas was worth exactly that amount to the institutional buyers. I wiped my face and realized my 14-year-old son was operating on a cognitive plane I could barely track. Exactly 14 months after that historic transaction, the corporate parasites smelled the capital. I was standing in my boatyard when my smartphone registered an incoming call from an unlisted New York exchange. The caller identified herself as Beatrice, an elite Manhattan family law attorney whose firm notoriously bills their clients in strict predatory 6-minute increments. "Mr. Vance," Beatrice stated, her voice as smooth and freezing as polished window glass. "I am reaching out to your office regarding a high-priority filing concerning the financial welfare and asset management of Caleb Holloway." I cut through her script instantly. "His legal name is Davis Vance," I corrected, my voice dropping into a dangerous room temperature register. A brief, calculated pause unspooled over the line. "Yes, well, my client has filed a formal petition in the state of New York demanding full administrative oversight of the multi-million-dollar art trust. We are alleging systemic financial exploitation, and we are pursuing a comprehensive forensic review of your management parameters." I sat down slowly on a timber beam. "And who exactly is your client, Beatrice?" A longer, heavier pause followed. "Eleanor Holloway, the biological mother." The English language lacks a definitive quantitative term to describe the exact psychological fusion of unmitigated fury and absolute disbelief that slammed into my chest. It is the precise systemic shock you experience when an uninvited parasite attempts to violently flip the entire corporate board right after you have spent 15 years manually building every single hotel on the map. I went completely, dangerously still. "I want you to repeat that client name very clearly for the record, Beatrice," I murmured, impressed by the clinical calibration of my own voice. She executed the script again, adding that as the biological mother, Eleanor possessed clear statutory standing to petition for the trust's receivership, citing severe questions regarding whether Davis's best interests are being properly represented by an isolated blue-collar tradesman. I set the device flatly on the timber workbench, walked to the window, and watched Davis sitting beneath the ancient coastal pine tree in his regular spot, his sketchbook stabilized on his lap, completely at peace with the universe. I picked the phone back up. "Tell your client she is welcome to test the structural integrity of my perimeter," I said, and terminated the connection. By exactly Thursday morning, Eleanor weaponized her massive Manhattan wealth and high-level public relations connections to launch a calculated, hyper-aggressive, nationwide media smear campaign designed to completely liquidate my reputation before we ever crossed the threshold of a courthouse. The New York tabloids and digital news syndicates ran highly coordinated, sensationalist headlines that behaved like an airborne infection across the internet. "Isolated backwoods carpenter exploits autistic son's $1 million art gift for personal capital," the front page alert screamed. Eleanor's PR firm constructed a narrative that was devastatingly sympathetic to the elite Manhattan demographic. A deeply worried high society mother fighting through systemic legal barriers to rescue her vulnerable, developmentally disabled son from the controlling, aggressive grip of an isolated father in the Maine wilderness. To ensure the public execution was absolute, Eleanor's legal team presented a series of completely fabricated, forged email correspondences allegedly extracted from my private digital address, arranging dark margin side deals with independent galleries without Davis's knowledge or consent. Suddenly, the 34 years of unassailable professional integrity I'd constructed was completely erased by a digitized media circus. By 7 a.m. Thursday, my private phone was vibrating continuously with frantic alerts from former clients. My local banking lines were temporarily frozen for risk assessment, and a swarm of fresh, unbothered New York reporters had actively breached the perimeter of my quiet Bar Harbor property, thrusting cameras against my timber fence line before I had even cleared the morning fog from my eyes. I sat at my kitchen table in the dim morning light, reading the digital destruction of my name, feeling a raw, heavy surge of genuine fear, not for my own survival, but for the catastrophic damage this loud, transactional circus was about to inflict on the one sanctuary where my son had always been completely safe. By Thursday night, the suffocating atmosphere inside our Bar Harbor kitchen had hardened into something completely unmanageable. The room was illuminated only by the cold, blue glare of my laptop screen and the erratic flashing of my smartphone as another wave of sensationalized Manhattan headlines materialized online. I sat frozen at the oak table, my chest tight with an absolute, unvarnished panic that I hadn't experienced since Eleanor first vanished 20 years ago. Across from me sat Preston, our family attorney, a rugged, battle-tested Maine native who had managed my asset protection for 2 decades. He was aggressively rubbing his temples, his legal notepad covered in frantic, crossed-out defensive strategies. "Garrick, we are losing the structural stability of this case by the hour," Preston warned. His voice dropped into a heavy defensive register. "The court of public opinion has already executed a verdict against your name. If we don't release an immediate press statement countering these forged emails, Eleanor's team will use this media momentum to freeze the Art Trust administrative access before we even step foot inside the Ellsworth courthouse." Before I could formulate a clinical response, the heavy timber door to the hallway slid open with absolute rhythmic precision. Davis stepped into the kitchen, entirely unruffled by the high-stakes corporate warfare currently consuming our home. He was wearing his standard gray fleece hoodie, his hands tucked loosely into his front pocket. Without uttering a single word of preface, he walked directly to the center of the oak table, bypassed Preston's legal briefs, and set down a thick, heavy, matte black notebook with a definitive, solid thud. He pulled out a wooden chair, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly into my panicked eyes with the absolute, unhurried calm of a seasoned operations director. "You are wasting valuable cognitive energy on their public relations matrix, Dad," Davis stated, his voice completely level and room temperature. "I have been actively running a comprehensive counterintelligence operation against my biological mother and her legal representatives for exactly 8 months. I initiated the tracking protocol the precise millisecond I detected a series of illegal, unauthorized digital background pings targeting our private offshore bank accounts and my trust ledger logs." Preston froze mid-sentence, his pen hovering dangerously close to his legal pads as his brain desperately scrambled to calculate the sudden shift in the room's data. He stared at the 15-year-old boy sitting across from him as if Davis had just spoken in a foreign, encrypted language. "Davis, what exactly are you talking about?" Preston stammered, his polished legal composure fracturing completely. Davis didn't offer a subjective explanation. He simply reached forward with his pale, steady fingers and slid the matte black notebook open, revealing a meticulously organized, color-coded index that looked more like a federal audit report than a child's diary. "Please reference the primary green tabs," Davis directed. his voice dropping into a crisp, diagnostic cadence as he began systematically walking us through the forensic compilation. What sat before our eyes was a flawless, unassailable forensic archive detailing 20 years of uninterrupted presence. Section 1 contained a complete, chronologically alphabetized ledger of 15 continuous years of certified medical and therapeutic billing records, with every single line item proving that Garrick Vance was the solitary guarantor and attending parent. Section 2 held individual IEP school files, developmental progress metrics, and public administration logs spanning from 2014 to 2026, each one exclusively signed by my hand, with Eleanor's name completely absent from every legal margin. But the true, devastating variable of this section was the digital forensic data. Davis flipped to a series of crimson-coded spreadsheets containing verified, decrypted network tracing logs. He proved with absolute mathematical certainty that 11 months prior, Beatrice's high-priced Manhattan law firm had utilized a private corporate intelligence contractor to execute a series of unauthorized, highly illegal data scrapes on our personal asset registries and private medical histories, leaving a distinct digital footprint that Davis had trapped, logged, and notarized before they could clear their server caches. The absolute finality of the data sitting on the table completely stripped Preston of his legal vocabulary. He leaned over the spreadsheets, his eyes scanning the IP addresses and corporate registration numbers with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. This is an industrial-scale compliance breach, Preston whispered, his hands visibly shaking as he turned the page. Davis, this doesn't just dismantle her petition. This opens their entire Manhattan firm up to immediate federal civil litigation. But they will still try to weaponize the emotional narrative at the hearing. They will claim a mother's natural instinct was simply blocked by your father. Davis calmly turned the black notebook to the final, gold-bordered divider. They no longer possess an emotional narrative to liquidate, Davis stated flatly. Behold the crown jewel of my defensive archive. He slid a compact, encrypted digital audio drive across the table and pressed the playback mechanism. The kitchen was instantly filled with the audio transmission of a forgotten voicemail left on an unlisted family line back in the autumn of 2019. The voice on the recording was unmistakably Eleanor's, though her elite Upper East Side cadence was visibly slurred, sloppy, and heavily degenerated by intoxication. Listen to me, Garrick. Her voice rasped off the stone walls, completely stripped of her current curated public relations warmth. I am calling to tell you to stop sending updates through the lawyers. I cannot handle what Davis is. I have made absolute, total peace with my decision to walk away from that situation permanently. I hope the boy is being taken care of by the local state programs, but I am completely incapable of being the person to do it. Do not contact my office again. The recording cut out, leaving a freezing, absolute silence inside the Terrytown war room. I looked across at my son, my jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached as the memory of her abandonment cut into my chest. Davis, how did you secure this? I managed to ask, my voice rough. Davis looked at me, his expression entirely serene, unhurt, and uncompromised by the horror of the audio file. She left that message on a server I monitored when I was 11 years old, he explained smoothly. I recognized the legal risk parameters immediately. I systematically timestamped the metadata, executed 3 separate encrypted cloud backups on secure offshore servers, and formally notarized the physical text transcript through an encrypted online legal registry 5 years ago. An 11-year-old boy legally preserved his own mother's total rejection so that when she eventually returned to liquidate his assets, the bill would be completely ready for collection. The silver bullet is locked in the chamber, Dad. Let us go to court. Preston leaned forward over the mahogany table, his eyes bright with a sudden, aggressive legal adrenaline as he slammed his fist flatly onto the spreadsheets. This is our immediate leverage point, Garrick, the attorney stated, his voice tight with urgency. We take this entire black notebook, the digital logs, the unauthorized scrapes, and the 2019 voicemail transcript, and we dump it directly onto the Associated Press wire in a single, massive, devastating press release by 6 a.m. tomorrow. We hit her PR firm with the absolute maximum weight of the evidence all at once, blinding them before they can even file their preliminary motions in court. I began to nod, my defensive instincts screaming for immediate public clearance, but Davis raised a single, steady hand from his fleece pocket, instantly freezing the attorney mid-sentence with an absolute, unexecutable authority. Your legal instincts are fundamentally uncalibrated for modern digital syndication, Preston, Davis stated, his voice dropping into a freezing clinical register that completely stripped the room of emotion. If you execute a single mass document dump, the media architecture will treat it as a singular event. It will be swallowed entirely by one 24-hour news cycle, parsed poorly by algorithms, and buried beneath the next national headline by Friday afternoon. Eleanor's high-priced crisis management team will simply absorb the initial hit, issue a blanket denial, and wait for the public memory to reset. He adjusted his glasses, his pale fingers tapping the matte black cover of his ledger as he outlined a predatory 14-day media counter-strategy. We will not give them a single explosion, Preston. We will execute a systematic daily liquidation of their credibility. We will release exactly one undeniable piece of forensic data every 24 hours for 14 consecutive days. We will control the narrative pace, forcing the press to return to our database every single morning for their primary content, systematically starving Eleanor's public narrative of oxygen until her elite Manhattan supporters cannot breathe the air in their own offices. Over the course of the following 7 days, Davis's hand-selected New England legal team executed the strategic timeline with the cold, automated precision of an industrial press machine. The strategic counterstrike did not arrive as a loud, emotional defense. It landed like a series of perfectly timed, highly destructive drumbeats against Eleanor's corporate infrastructure. On Monday, day 1, the team dropped the certified 15-year archive of Davis's individual IEP school filings, featuring a single repetitive signature line, Garrick Vance. The public relations team at the Upper East Side had absolutely zero warning. On Wednesday, day 3, Davis's own formal, written personal statement was broadcasted directly to the major New York digital syndicates. A brief, devastatingly precise layout of his life, his father's constant presence, and the absolute geometric void left by his biological mother. On Thursday, day 4, the notarized 2019 audio transcript of Eleanor admitting she could not handle her own child was leaked in full, complete with verified server metadata. The trajectory of the New York press shifted with a sudden, catastrophic velocity that left Eleanor's high society circle completely paralyzed. The sensationalized word exploitation vanished from the digital media grid entirely within 48 hours, replaced by massive, high-priority investigative headlines exposing Eleanor's multi-million-dollar civil fraud, malicious misrepresentation, and unauthorized digital bank scraping. The Tier 1 news anchors who had previously branded me a greedy backwoods carpenter were now running prime-time forensic breakdowns of the digital footprints Davis had trapped, openly questioning the moral and legal validity of Eleanor's petition. The court of public opinion had completely reversed its judgment, transforming her predatory asset grab into a documented case of corporate extortion before a single witness had even been sworn in at the Hancock County Courthouse. By day 12 of the strategic leak, the predatory architecture of Eleanor's legal and public relations defensive shield fractured completely under the continuous, unyielding weight of the daily forensic drops. The elite Manhattan PR firm she had hired for hundreds of thousands of dollars quietly terminated their representation to protect their own corporate standing, leaving Beatrice, her ruthless family law attorney, to face the media storm entirely isolated. Beatrice issued a frantic, deeply desperate late-night press statement, her polished legal cadence completely unraveled as she labeled the systematic document releases an unregulated, emotionally harassing digital campaign designed to traumatize a concerned mother. It was the exact linguistic signature of a defeated litigator who had run entirely out of viable chess moves. However, the definitive structural collapse occurred within Eleanor's private alliance. Robert, the senior Wall Street corporate equity partner she had initially abandoned our 3-year-old son to run off with, calculated the immense financial and reputational liability of the pending federal civil litigation and executed a total, instantaneous retreat. He went completely, chillingly dark on Wednesday afternoon, terminating his personal communication lines, ignoring Beatrice's urgent legal memos, and completely abandoning Eleanor's defensive team to protect his own massive corporate assets and institutional boards from the radioactive fallout of her public exposure. The wealthy Manhattan paradise she had built on the wreckage of my son's childhood had turned into an economic vacuum. As the final hearing loomed on the October horizon, the high society ghost of Wall Street was left standing completely alone in the cold light of her own choices, realizing that the 15-year-old boy she had discarded had systematically stripped her of every single asset she possessed. The final custody and trust hearing convened on a bitterly cold Thursday morning in October at the Hancock County Courthouse in Ellsworth, Maine. I woke up at exactly 4:30 a.m. in a state of intense, suffocating anxiety, my mind frantically cycling through a toxic mental list of every single procedural metric that could go wrong in a New England courtroom. The weight of the impending legal showdown sat heavily on my chest as I walked down the dim hallway of our stone house, expecting to find my son paralyzed by the weight of the morning. Instead, the kitchen was completely enveloped in a profound, comfortable silence. Davis was already sitting at the oak table, completely dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit that he had meticulously selected and procured himself without a single word of parental prompting. His black notebook sat open beside a plate of perfectly browned toast he had prepared for the two of us. He didn't look up immediately as I stopped dead in the doorway, his focus entirely anchored by his own unhurried baseline. When his eyes finally locked onto mine, he didn't offer a standard, superficial script of reassurance. Instead, he delivered a sharp, transformative truth that sliced cleanly through 20 years of my private, unaudited guilt. "You did not fail the operational protocol, Dad," Davis stated, his voice perfectly level, calm, and stripped of all emotional inflation. "I know your system still carries the diagnostic error of those 4 days when I was 3 years old. I know you replay the empty driveway. You need to permanently terminate that loop. You didn't leave the perimeter. That is the entire historical record. Stop carrying their debt." I stood frozen as the raw, healing power of his statement settled into my chest cavity, realizing that the 15-year-old boy I thought I was protecting was already operating with a level of sovereign dignity I had spent a lifetime trying to engineer for him. I sat down, ate the toast, and prepared to breach their final line. We arrived at the massive granite courthouse downtown at exactly 8:30 a.m., the sharp October wind coming off the Atlantic Bay doing what it always does to the historic stone steps, making everything look ancient, unyielding, and completely stripped of human warmth. As we crossed the threshold into the towering, echo-filled lobby, the opposition was already staged near the primary security checkpoint. Eleanor stood in the center of the marble floor, flanked by Beatrice and the final two members of her high society corporate security detail. At 51, Eleanor looked immaculately polished, wrapped in an outrageously expensive Manhattan cashmere wool coat that had been perfectly engineered to project effortless, aristocratic maternal authority to the local press corridor. However, as I maintained a steady, clinical stride across the lobby, my diagnostic tracking focused directly on her eyes. Behind the pristine makeup and the high-end styling, her gaze betrayed a deep, unexecutable structural panic. The 14 days of systematic forensic data leaks had completely liquidated her legal stance, and she knew the ground beneath her expensive boots had shifted entirely. She looked down at Davis, her mouth opening slightly as if expecting a tearful, emotional childhood reconciliation that her PR team could weaponize for the cameras. Davis stopped precisely 3 feet from her position. He didn't flinch. He didn't display anger, and he didn't validate her biological claim. Instead, he calmly looked through her, executing a tight, polite nod of pure, absolute detachment, the precise look of a complete stranger, holding a commercial elevator door for someone he had never seen before in his entire existence. Eleanor visibly flinched, as if struck by physical force, her carefully managed composure fracturing instantly, as she realized she was completely invisible to the child she had come to exploit. The formal hearing initiated at precisely 9:10 a.m. Inside the wood-paneled chambers of the court, but by the 11:15 a.m. judicial recess, the absolute destruction of Eleanor's petition was already an audited reality. Judge Carol Whitfield, a measured, silver-haired jurist who had spent 3 decades parsing human nonsense, reviewed the certified school IEP filings and the notarized forensic scraping logs with an expression of intense, supreme dissatisfaction. She openly reprimanded Beatrice during the oral arguments, labeling the petition's lack of substantive baseline data a severe waste of state administrative resources. As the court cleared for the brief intermission, Davis calmly closed his black notebook, buttoned his navy suit jacket, and authorized Preston to deliver a final sealed transaction envelope to Eleanor's legal team in the corridor. The document inside was written in the precise, quantitative language Davis had personal oversight of the night before. It was exactly 3 paragraphs long, offering Eleanor a single, final conditional opportunity to exit the state of Maine clean. She was required to execute a total permanent legal waiver of all future personal, parental, and financial claims to Davis's life, trust assets and name, and leave the county immediately. In exchange for this total relinquishment of control, Davis agreed to permanently terminate the daily document releases, pursue no civil action for malicious defamation, and maintain absolute public silence regarding her history. Beatrice read the terms, her face pale as she urgently whispered into Eleanor's ear in the corner of the stone hallway, gesturing toward the courtroom doors. But Eleanor looked up, her jaw rigid, her chest heaving with an unaudited, deep-seated Upper East Side arrogance that refused to accept a blue-collar defeat. Driven by pure, unmitigated pride and the complete inability to comprehend that a 15-year-old child had completely out-engineered her entire Wall Street apparatus, she looked directly at Davis and fiercely shook her head, rejecting the settlement terms. She genuinely believed the offer was nothing but a desperate, backwoods bluff from an isolated father. She had no idea she had just locked the door of her own trap from the inside. The absolute finality of Eleanor's rejection left no further room for procedural delay. The moment court reconvened at exactly 1:15 p.m., the atmospheric density inside the Hancock County Courthouse shifted into a freezing clinical register. Davis did not display a single microsecond of hesitation or emotional distress regarding his biological mother's choice. He stood up from our defense table, buttoned his navy suit jacket with complete, unhurried baseline efficiency, and calmly signaled the court bailiff to bring a massive, flat package wrapped in heavy brown security paper and sealed with high-grade industrial tape directly into the center of the well. Beatrice leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing in immediate legal apprehension, preparing to enter a standard procedural objection regarding late-stage evidence submission. But Davis completely cut through her strategy before she could state her line items. He did not introduce the hidden cash as standard aesthetic production or commercial property assets. He formally entered the sequence of 10 large masterwork canvases into the official state record as a certified visual psychological evaluation of maternal abandonment. These 10 line items are not being submitted to this court for artistic analysis, Your Honor, Davis stated, his voice ringing through the wood-paneled room with the absolute, level authority of a senior medical director. They represent a continuous, uninterrupted decade of empirical psychological data captured through an absolute photographic memory, documenting the precise, quantifiable timeline of a clinical abandonment from age 6 to age 15. They are the physical ledger of an eviction. The bailiff slit the security tape with a utility blade, Pulling back the heavy paper to expose the raw evidence to the light of the courtroom, Judge Carol Whitfield leaned forward over the elevated mahogany bench, her silver-haired composure completely focused as she initiated a chronological, line-by-line review of the 10 canvases. The early work, executed at age 6, was anchored by massive strokes of warm crimson, brilliant gold, and deep ochre. It depicted a tall woman rendered in the loose, searching perspective of a tiny boy who desperately misses a foundational presence, but lacks the verbal vocabulary to articulate the theft. The figure was facing completely away from the viewer, but she remained physically close to the center grid of the canvas. By age 8, however, the temperature of the collection had cooled with catastrophic velocity. Dark blues, clinical indigos, and sharp charcoal grays began aggressively creeping in from the margins. The woman had been pushed significantly further away, her scale reduced, her form becoming a hazy, distant suggestion. By exactly age 10, the figure had been completely marginalized, drawn as nothing but a cold, translucent gray outline trapped at the absolute microscopic border of the frame. The physical artwork explicitly documented the precise, unalterable timeline of Eleanor's total psychological eviction from the architecture of Davis's mind. The true, devastating parameter of this visual deposition materialized on the canvases matching ages 11, 12, and 13. In these structural works, the female form vanished from the canvas grid entirely, leaving absolutely zero traces of her historical existence. The vacant space had been completely re-engineered, replaced by a dense, warm light illuminating a heavy oak kitchen table inside a rugged timber home. In the center of the frame sat a lone, broad-shouldered man, his hands worn from boat building, quietly and methodically watching over the absolute perimeter of the property while the winter snow tapped against the glass. The art did not lie. It proved with mathematical certainty that by the time Eleanor was plotting her multi-million-dollar trust grab in Manhattan, she had already been dead and buried inside her son's consciousness for years. The courtroom was gripped by an unyielding, suffocating silence that carried the physical weight of an industrial collapse. Beatrice sat completely paralyzed, her hands frozen over her legal pad, while Eleanor stared at the 10 canvases with a hollow, wide-eyed horror, looking directly at the physical proof of her own total erasure. Davis stepped up to the final display easel, pulling back the remaining layer of security paper to present the canvas painted at exactly age 15. The masterwork was titled with absolute simplicity, "This is enough." It was structurally completely different from the preceding timeline. It carried zero trace of historical absence, zero lingering grief, and absolutely no searching metrics. It depicted our rugged coastal porch in Bar Harbor, catching the sharp, blinding morning light of the North Atlantic sun. In the absolute center of the wooden porch railing, rendered with pristine, hyper-focused architectural detail, sat a single, steaming black coffee cup, the exact, unalterable visual anchor of my 20-year daily presence in his life. It was the physical monument of the man who stayed. Across the bottom right corner of the canvas, where an artist standardly places a commercial signature, Davis's precise, level hand had written the definitive data point of the entire case. "It's always been you, Dad." The room fell into a dead, unexecutable silence so profound that the rhythmic hum of the ceiling ventilation system sounded like a mechanical roar. I looked across at Eleanor, watching her hands tremble violently in her lap as the finality of the ledger settled into her soul. She was finally being forced to comprehend the absolute cost of her choice. She had come to exploit $1 million asset, only to discover that the child she abandoned had legally, forensically, and permanently deleted her from reality. The visual deposition of the 10 canvases did not merely shift the legal momentum within the Hancock County courthouses. It executed a total instantaneous liquidation of the opposition's entire operational capacity. Faced with the combined, unyielding weight of overwhelming digital forensics, the unauthorized bank scraping logs, and the devastating, undeniable psychological proof of a decade of total maternal absence, Eleanor's high-stakes trust petition collapsed entirely. Beatrice, the elite Manhattan litigator who had entered the building billing by the 6-minute block, sat frozen behind her mahogany desk, her eyes scanning the room as she calculated the immediate catastrophic risk to her own firm's regulatory standing if this file proceeded to a formal judicial order. Before the court clerk could even announce the scheduled midday recess, Beatrice rose from her chair, her polished Upper East Side composure completely shattered. Her voice trembled with a rare, desperate urgency as she formally addressed Judge Carol Whitfield, entering a motion to immediately and permanently withdraw the lawsuit with prejudice. This meant the case was legally dead, locked in a vault, and entirely incapable of ever being refiled in the state of Maine or New York. The tactical surrender was absolute. Eleanor didn't wait to sign the administrative tracking logs or consult with her remaining security detail. She frantically grabbed her expensive designer bag and escaped the courthouse through a restricted side exit, ducking her head to avoid the flashing lenses of the local press corridor as she fled into a waiting black corporate sedan. The vehicle tore away from the curb into the freezing Atlantic drizzle, leaving her high society dreams in absolute ruins. The public disclosure of her calculated abandonment and financial extortion had been permanently etched into the state record, ensuring her pristine Manhattan reputation was completely, irrevocably destroyed across every social and corporate registry on the East Coast. The heavy granite doors of the courthouse closed behind us, cutting off the residual noise of the legal circus and leaving only the clean, sharp autumn air of the Maine coastline. Garrick and Davis did not execute a loud, performative celebration, nor did we contact the media syndicates to boast of our total administrative victory. Instead, we calmly navigated away from the downtown grid, driving in comfortable, structured silence to our historic, regular booth at the classic American diner on Carver Street, the exact modest establishment we had frequented since Davis was 7 years old. The owner, a seasoned coastal local who had watched our family navigate the hard years, nodded silently as we took our seats by the window, immediately sliding 2 plates of our regular order onto the table without requiring a single word of instruction. The low, late October sun cut through the clean glass at a sharp angle, casting a calm, golden illumination across the laminated tabletop. Davis unzipped his navy suit jacket, pulled his matte black notebook from his portfolio, and calmly turned past the forensic indexing to a fresh, pristine white page, immediately beginning to trace a new, unhurried sketch with the steady, automated precision of a master builder. I lifted my mug, taking a slow sip of my black coffee in a state of absolute, uncompromised quiet. As I watched the steady movement of my son's pencil, a profound systemic understanding settled into my chest. I realized with absolute diagnostic clarity that true mercy is never soft, it is never compromising, and it never absorbs the toxic debt of a parasite. True mercy is the calculated, rigid enforcement of an unyielding boundary, the cold, unshakable refusal to move the perimeter line, which ultimately protects the innocent from the predatory and forces the universe to balance its own ledger. By the following Monday, the operational environment had returned to a state of flawless, permanent tranquility. Back in Bar Harbor, the final canvas of the deposition, the definitive 15-year masterwork titled, "This is Enough," was permanently, securely mounted to the exact center wall of Davis's coastal timber studio. The space was flooded with immaculate natural light coming off the Atlantic horizon, illuminating every single hyper-focused, architectural brushstroke of the frame. I stood entirely alone before the canvas for a long moment, my eyes tracking the sharp, white-lined depiction of the coastal porch railing and the solitary, steaming black coffee cup that anchored the center grid as I stared at the clean paint. The last lingering shards of my 20-year parental anxiety completely evaporated. I realized with absolute, unassailable certainty that I had officially retired from holding up a broken, tragic past to protect a daughter who didn't exist. I was finally beautifully free to occupy the reality I had manually constructed. Davis looked up from his design desk, his eyes clear, focused, and completely unhurt by the historic storm we had just neutralized. He didn't offer an emotional script, but he validated the entire 20-year ledger with a single, unalterable baseline conclusion. The man who stayed, the man who signed the papers, and the man who held the perimeter line was the only father who had ever existed in his universe. The debt was settled, the ledger was closed, and our sovereignty was absolute. If you found this clinical demolition of maternal audacity, forensic legal counterintelligence, and unyielding paternal boundaries deeply satisfying, do your own personal assets a massive favor right now. Slam that like button with absolute certainty. Drop a detailed comment below letting me know exactly what city, state, or coordinates you are tracking this transaction from, and ensure you are permanently subscribed to Dad's Ultimate Payback. Our database is completely locked, loaded, and continuously updated with the most calculated, ruthless, and profoundly rewarding stories of absolute compliance on the internet. Thank you for auditing the line items with us today, and I will officially see you on the very next procurement report.